It's funny how life works. One day you're screaming at a homeless woman for stealing your food, the next day you're paying her to pretend to love you. After a heated argument with his girlfriend, Andrew stormed out of his office, his heart pounding with frustration. Her words had cut deep, and the more he replayed their fight in his mind, the angrier he became. The busy city streets offered no solace as he walked aimlessly, trying to clear his head. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since morning. A small restaurant caught his eye, and he stepped inside, hoping a quiet meal might help calm his nerves. The waiter led him to a corner table, and Andrew ordered without really looking at the menu. As he sat there, pushing food around his plate, his girlfriend's accusations echoed in his mind. Why couldn't she understand his perspective? Why did she always have to make everything so difficult? Lost in his troubled thoughts, Andrew barely touched his meal. When he finally gave up trying to eat, he absent-mindedly rose from the table and walked out, completely forgetting his wallet behind. The cool evening air hit his face as he stepped outside, still consumed by his relationship problems. It wasn't until he'd walked several blocks that Andrew realized his wallet was missing. Cursing under his breath, he turned back toward the restaurant. As he approached, he noticed someone sitting at his table through the window, a young woman in tattered clothes, hungrily eating his leftover food. Something snapped inside Andrew. All the frustration and anger from his earlier argument came rushing back. Finding a new target, he burst through the door and stormed over to the table. "What do you think you're doing?" he shouted, looming over the stranger. "Are you stealing my food?" The young woman Amanda looked up at him with startled eyes. Her face was dirty but couldn't hide her beauty even in that moment of fear. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I haven't eaten in days. I didn't mean any harm." But Andrew wasn't interested in explanations. His anger had found an outlet, and he couldn't see past it. "That's no excuse," he snapped. "You can't just take what isn't yours." His voice was cold, dismissive, refusing to acknowledge the desperation in her eyes. Amanda stood up slowly, tears welling in her eyes. She apologized again, but Andrew remained unmoved, watching with stern judgment as she hurried out of the restaurant. Only after she left did a twinge of guilt begin to creep in, but he quickly pushed it aside, snatching his wallet from the table. When Andrew finally returned home that evening, his girlfriend's angry voice greeted him on his phone, demanding to know where he'd been. As he listened to her complaints, the image of Amanda's frightened face kept floating back into his mind, an uncomfortable reminder of how quickly anger could turn someone cruel. But he wasn't ready to admit that yet, not to himself, and certainly not to anyone else. When Andrew's girlfriend finally answered his call, her tone was ice cold. Instead of discussing their earlier argument, she made an unexpected demand, a large sum of money in exchange for attending tomorrow's important party with him. Andrew sat in stunned silence, the phone pressed against his ear. He'd always been generous with her, but this felt different. This was extortion, plain and simple. After hanging up, Andrew paced his living room, running his fingers through his hair in frustration. He couldn't show up alone. It wasn't that kind of event. As he stood by his window, gazing at the street below, an unlikely solution came to mind: Amanda, the homeless girl from the restaurant. Despite his harsh treatment of her, he couldn't forget how striking she had been, even in her disheveled state. The next morning, Andrew searched the streets where he'd last seen her. He finally spotted Amanda sitting at her usual corner, her shoulders hunched against the morning chill. When she saw him approaching, her expression hardened, clearly remembering their last encounter. "I know I treated you terribly," Andrew began, forcing humility into his voice. "I was having a bad day, but that's no excuse." Amanda's eyes remained cold, distrustful. She asked why he was really there, expecting nothing good. Andrew took a deep breath and laid out his proposition. He explained about the party, his need for a date, and most importantly, the substantial payment he was offering. Amanda's expression shifted from skepticism to disbelief as he mentioned the amount more money than she'd seen in months. "You're joking," she said, letting out a harsh laugh. "You yell at me for eating leftovers, and now you want me to be your date." She shook her head, but Andrew could see the calculation in her eyes. The money would mean food, maybe even temporary shelter. After a long pause, Amanda agreed, making it clear this was strictly business. "I'm not doing this to help you," she stated firmly. "I'm doing it for the money, nothing more." Hours later, Amanda stood before a mirror, transformed. The elegant dress Andrew had bought draped perfectly over her figure, her hair styled with professional precision. When Andrew arrived to pick her up, he froze in the doorway, momentarily speechless at her transformation. At the party, Amanda moved through the crowd with unexpected grace. She laughed at the right moments, asked thoughtful questions, and charmed everyone she met. Guests kept approaching Andrew, eager to know more about his mysterious, beautiful date. He would smile, offering vague responses while watching Amanda work the room like she'd been born to it. By the end of the night, as they walked to the car, Andrew felt a mixture of relief and surprise. Not only had Amanda pulled it off, she'd exceeded all expectations. As he handed her the promised payment, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd underestimated her all along. Amanda accepted the money with a quiet thank you and walked away, leaving Andrew to contemplate how a desperate plan had turned into such an unexpected success. Andrew had barely stepped through his front door when he found his father waiting, stern-faced and resolute. Without preamble, his father delivered an ultimatum that made Andrew's blood run cold: no marriage, no company inheritance. The family business, his future, everything he'd worked for, all of it now hinged on finding a wife. Standing in his living room after his father left, Andrew's mind raced. Then, like a lifeline in choppy waters, he thought of Amanda. Their arrangement at the party had worked perfectly. Why not extend it? His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed her number, the plan forming rapidly in his mind. Amanda answered with surprise in her voice, clearly not expecting to hear from him again. "I have another proposition," Andrew said, trying to keep his voice steady. "A bigger one this time." He explained his father's demand and laid out his offer: a fully furnished apartment, regular payments, and the chance to leave street life behind. All she had to do was pretend to be his fiancée. Silence filled the line as Amanda processed his words. The offer was incredible, almost too good to be true. A real bed to sleep in, food whenever she wanted, no more begging on street corners. But there was hesitation in her voice when she finally spoke. "Your family, they'll expect to meet me. To get to know me." "You handled the party perfectly," Andrew reminded her. "This isn't so different." He increased the offer, watching the numbers climb until he heard her breath catch. It was more money than she'd ever dreamed of having. "Just until you get the company?" she asked, her voice careful, measured. "Just until then," he confirmed. Another pause, shorter this time. "Okay," Amanda agreed, "I'll do it." The following week, Andrew brought Amanda to meet his family. She stepped into their grand estate wearing a dress that made her look like she belonged there, her posture perfect, her smile confident. Andrew's father stood waiting in the living room, his eyes sharp and evaluating as Amanda approached. But from the moment Amanda began to speak, her natural charm took over. She navigated the conversation with grace, sharing carefully crafted stories about her background that matched what Andrew had told them. She laughed at his father's jokes, complimented his mother's taste in art, and spoke intelligently about current events. By the end of the evening, Andrew's father pulled him aside, beaming. "She's perfect, son," he said, clapping Andrew on the shoulder. "Exactly the kind of woman I hoped you'd find." Andrew forced a smile, guilt gnawing at his insides as he watched Amanda charming his mother across the room. As they drove away later, Andrew couldn't help but be impressed. Amanda had transformed herself completely, playing the role of the perfect future daughter-in-law with seemingly effortless grace. But as he glanced at her profile in the darkness of the car, he wondered if perhaps she wasn't playing a role at all. Maybe this was who she truly was, once given the chance to be something more than just a homeless girl. As weeks passed, Andrew's father grew increasingly fond of Amanda, constantly singing her praises and including her in family gatherings. He'd call her just to chat, send her thoughtful gifts, and treat her like the daughter he never had. But while his father was thoroughly charmed, Andrew noticed his mother's watchful eyes following Amanda's every move, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Meanwhile, Monica, Andrew's ex-girlfriend, had been quietly seething. The occasional glimpses of Andrew and Amanda in society papers, at charity events and family functions drove her to investigate this mysterious woman who had seemingly appeared from nowhere. She hired a private investigator, and within days the truth landed on her desk: photographs of Amanda on street corners, begging for change, sleeping in doorways. Monica's lips curved into a cruel smile as she drove to Amanda's new apartment. When Amanda opened the door, Monica burst in, waving the photographs like weapons. I know exactly who you are, she spat. A homeless nobody playing dress up? Wait until Andrew's family finds out. But Amanda didn't cower as Monica expected. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a small smirk playing on her lips. Go ahead, she said coolly. Tell them. Andrew chose me, not you. He brings me home to his family, not you. I'm wearing his ring, not you. Each word struck like a precise dart, leaving Monica speechless with rage. Humiliated but not defeated, Monica drove straight to Andrew's family estate. His mother answered the door, elegant as always, but her eyes lit up with interest as Monica revealed her purpose. They sat in the sunlit conservatory as Monica laid out the evidence, the photos, the background check, the entire scheme between Andrew and Amanda. She's nothing but a homeless orphan, Monica spat, watching Andrew's mother's face carefully. They've been lying to you all along. It's all been an act to get the company. Andrew's mother sat very still, her teacup frozen halfway to her lips. Everything suddenly made sense, the odd moments she'd noticed, the little inconsistencies in Amanda's stories, the strange feeling that she'd seen her somewhere before. Her suspicions had been right all along. I knew there was something not quite right about her, she whispered, more to herself than to Monica. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her teacup, her mind racing through every interaction with Amanda, seeing them in a new light. Monica sat back, satisfied with the chaos she'd unleashed. But she hadn't anticipated what came next. Instead of immediately calling Andrew or confronting Amanda, Andrew's mother quietly asked her to leave. There was something calculating in her eyes, something that suggested she would handle this situation her own way. As Monica drove away, feeling triumphant, Andrew's mother stood at her window, watching the rain begin to fall. The truth about Amanda had confirmed her worst fears, but something else nagged at her, the way her son looked at Amanda when he thought no one was watching. Was it possible that what had started as a scheme had become something real? Andrew was at his desk when his mother burst into his office, her face flushed with anger. A homeless girl, Andrew. Really, her words cut through the air like ice. Monica told me everything. But as Andrew stood to defend himself, to explain the scheme, something unexpected happened. Instead of the rehearsed excuses he'd prepared, the truth spilled out, not just about the deception, but about how his feelings had changed. His voice softened as he spoke about Amanda, about seeing her true strength, her kindness, her resilience. His mother watched in silence as her son's mask fell away, revealing the love he'd been hiding even from himself. That evening, his father called a family meeting. Andrew's stomach churned as they all gathered in the living room, expecting the worst, but his father surprised them all. Setting down his newspaper, he looked directly at Andrew and said, "I've known about Amanda's background for weeks." The room fell silent. Andrew's mother gasped, "You knew?" "Of course I knew," he replied calmly. "I have my sources, but I've watched how she carries herself, how she treats others, how she makes our son smile. That tells me more about her character than any background check ever could." Meanwhile, Monica made one last desperate attempt to destroy the relationship. She spread rumors throughout their social circle, but instead of the scandal she expected, she found people admiring Amanda's rise from adversity. Humiliated and defeated, Monica booked a one-way ticket to Europe, leaving behind only the bitter taste of failure. That night, Andrew drove to Amanda's apartment, his heart racing. He found her packing, assuming the worst after his mother's confrontation. But instead of saying goodbye, Andrew took her hands in his and finally spoke the truth he'd been avoiding. "This started as a business arrangement," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you. Not the act, not the person we created for my family, but you, the strong, beautiful woman who survived on those streets and never lost her dignity." Amanda's eyes filled with tears as she confessed she'd fallen in love with him too, even when she tried not to, even when she told herself it was just business. 2 months later, they stood together in the garden of Andrew's family estate, exchanging vows under a canopy of flowers. Amanda wore a simple white dress, her eyes shining with joy as she looked at Andrew. His father beamed from the front row while his mother dabbed at her eyes, having finally embraced the woman who had stolen her son's heart. As they shared their first dance as husband and wife, Amanda whispered in Andrew's ear, "Did you ever imagine that yelling at a homeless girl for eating your leftovers would lead to this?" Andrew pulled her closer, smiling. Sometimes he replied, the best things in life come from the most unexpected places.